Chapter 4 Brook and Beaver Pond. The canoe rushed down a snowy canyon with steep sides. The busy brook backed it, pushed it forward, rolled it under, sent it on, and finally dropped it into the quiet water of a pond. Beavers had made this pond by building a dam of logs and sticks plastered with mud. To do this, they had gnawed down trees. The stumps of the trees showed here and there along the banks. In the middle of the pond, the beavers had built their home, an island of sticks with an underwater entrance, safe from enemies. Inside, on a shelf above water level, the nest of soft rushes would always be warm and dry. An old beaver crept out of the water, sleek and dripping, to sit on the roof and scratch himself in the sun. A buck deer waded in the shallows. He had only one antler, and the weight of it made him walk with his head turned aside. He swung the antler hard against a stump. It came off easily and dropped into the mud. He shook his head and bounded off into the forest, glad to be free of the weight. By fall, he would grow a new set of weapons. A mink dived off a melting snowbank and came up with a fish. A muskrat swam past the drifting canoe and disappeared into the dead rushes. A skunk met a porcupine on a log. Each looked disgusted, turned about, and waddled solemnly away. The flooding pond burst through a corner of the beaver dam that afternoon. Old leaves, with Paddle in the midst of them, pushed through the gap. Paddle to the sea was free. The little canoe rushed on with the brook, on toward the river. Chapter 5 Breakup of the River. On a warm day, perhaps the very day that the snow had melted and started Paddle on his journey, the breakup of the river had come. All through the winter, the river had lain frozen. Wild animals had used it as an ice trail. Lumberjacks had used it as a road for taking their horses and tractors to the logging camps in the forest. But they had not hauled their logs to the sawmill this way. Instead, they had piled them up along the frozen banks, waiting for the river to carry them when the spring breakup came. And now it had come. Hundreds of brooks and streams had been flooding the river under its ice. The water, pushing from beneath, forced the ice upward. The banks shook as in an earthquake. Up and down the river, the glass pavement cracked all over. The cracks split open. Blocks of ice began to move downstream, faster and faster. A foaming river roared through the forest where the frozen trail had been. Paddle's canoe tumbled along with the brook until, with one last leap, it shot into the middle of the mad current of the river. The ice and the lumberman's logs crushed in on every side. Escaping again and again, Paddle raced on. The river rounded a bend. Logs and ice ahead plunged out of sight without warning. Paddle, too, plunged forward through mist, over the falls. He was still bottom side up in the water when a log rushed over the falls behind him, striking the canoe such a hard blow that it was wedged in a crack of the shaggy bark. And when the log raced away, it carried Paddle to the sea with it, upside down, underwater. Chapter 6. Paddle Meets a Sawmill. Paddle's log was 4 feet thick. Timbers and ice crashed against it, but it floated so low in the water that the canoe, held snugly underneath, was well out of danger. Hours went by. Days passed. In time, the river widened into a bay dotted with islands. The ice disappeared, and rivermen in spiked boots leaped from log to log, prodding them with long pike poles toward the sawmill. The mill, a mass of red buildings on stilts above the river bank, opened its wide mouth in the main building. From the mouth ran the log chute, a giant tongue licking into the water. A heavy chain of spikes moved up the center of the chute, turned over a wheel, and returned to the river, an endless belt called a bull chain. Rivermen pushed the logs onto the spikes, which carried them up the chute into the open mouth. A buzzing noise, which sometimes became a shriek, came from inside the mill. The great saws were at work. The spikes dug into Paddle's log. The great tree rolled over, bringing Paddle upright and dripping out of the water into the sunlight. The rivermen shouted with surprise as Paddle rode his log up the bull chain. At the top, he was heaved through the door onto a carrier that looked like a flat car. Ahead, the saw, an endless belt of thin steel, raced so fast its teeth were a blur. Paddle's log was being pushed nearer and nearer to the hungry saw. Chapter 7. Paddle Meets a Friend. The saw ripped into the end of Paddle's log. The blur of teeth came nearer and nearer. Suddenly, a hand snatched Paddle away. "By Joe!" yelled the lumberjack who had saved him. "Look what came up the bull chain! Pretty soon he would be split like a fish. Sit there, my friend. Tonight I take you to my little Henry." And he laid the carving on a shelf. The great log moved forward and back, and on each forward trip the bandsaw ate through it. The wide slabs, dropping away, slid on rollers to other saws and came from them as boards. Men pushed the new lumber away on flat cars to unload them outside the sawmill. The piles looked like rows of unpainted houses along a street. After work, the lumbermen looked at Paddle. They laughed at the way he had ridden the log into the sawmill. The French Canadian who had saved him read the message on the bottom of the canoe. Someone wanted the little figure to float to the sea. He would show it to his little boy and then toss it back to the river. But no, Henry would cry if he couldn't keep it. By Jove, best not to tell him at all. On his way home in the twilight, the lumberjack stopped on a bridge. He carved more letters in the canoe. Now the sign read, "Please put me back in water. I am Paddle to the Sea from Nipigon country, Canada." The Frenchman dropped the little canoe off the bridge. "Have a good voyage," he said, as he watched the river current carry Paddle away into the night.